You won't believe someone tried to find me for planting flowers in my own front yard. My name's Adrian, and that wasn't just a petty neighbor being nosy. That was the opening shot in a full-blown war with Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood, HOA. She thought I was just a quiet nobody. What she didn't know? I don't just own my house. I own the mortgage on every single one of hers. This is the true jaw-dropping story of how one HOA tyrant met the one resident she couldn't bully, and how her entire empire came crashing down. If you love watching arrogant power trip on its own leash, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Because this is the HOA Karen Files, where neighborhood nightmares meet their reckoning. The sun was blazing over Elmridge Heights that afternoon, glinting off luxury SUVs and immaculately trimmed hedges like a suburban showroom. Adrian Westbrook had barely stepped out of his modest black sedan when he felt it, the weight of eyes on him. "Excuse me," a voice rang out, sharp and frosted like chilled champagne. "You can't park here if you're visiting someone." Adrian turned slowly. The woman approaching was maybe late 50s, all precision. Platinum hair sculpted like a sculpture, pastel blouse crisply tucked into high-waisted slacks, and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. She wore power the way others wore perfume, liberally and deliberately. "I live here," Adrian said, calm but firm. The woman's gaze raked him from head to toe. Faded jeans, weathered leather boots, a t-shirt advertising some long-forgotten tech conference. She pursed her lips. "I see. Renting, then?" Adrian paused for a moment too long. "No shame in it," she added, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But renters don't always understand the standards we uphold here at Elmridge Heights. HOA compliance isn't optional, you know." Adrian smiled faintly, but his eyes gave nothing away. "Of course. I wouldn't dream of disrupting your standards." She extended a manicured hand. "Karen Whitmore, HOA president. I like to meet all new residents. Help set expectations." "Adrian Westbrook," he replied, shaking her hand. "Nice to meet you." Karen's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Westbrook? That name doesn't appear on our property owners list." "I'm sure there's a reason for that," Adrian said lightly. "Well," Karen said, clearly unsatisfied, "if you need any help understanding the rules, parking guidelines, garbage bin placements, lawn height limits, feel free to reach out." "I'll keep that in mind," Adrian said, already turning away. He hadn't taken 3 steps before she added, louder this time, "We've had some issues with short-term tenants thinking they can bend the rules, but Elmridge isn't that kind of place." Adrian glanced back. "Understood. Thanks for the welcome." Karen's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "We take pride in appearances here. And I take pride in patience," Adrian thought. Inside his house, a modest but well-built 2-story near the park, Adrian leaned against the kitchen counter, letting the silence settle. He could still hear her tone ringing in his ears, the casual disdain, the entitlement. It was familiar. He hadn't come to Elmridge Heights for prestige or status. After selling his second startup in a quiet acquisition deal, Adrian had deliberately avoided gated mansions and glass towers. He wanted quiet. Normalcy. Somewhere he could walk his dog and not be recognized. Apparently, that was a problem for some people. He poured himself a glass of water, the corners of his mouth twitching with amusement. Karen Whitmore had misjudged him, and not just a little. Because what Karen didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to ask, was that the house she dismissed as probably a rental was bought in cash under a holding trust tied directly to Adrian. And more importantly, far more deliciously, Adrian had acquired a significant minority stake in Halcyon Capital, a private equity firm that recently bought a bundle of distressed mortgages. Mortgages that included 5 properties in Elmridge Heights, properties that all belonged to Karen Whitmore. He didn't plan on saying anything. Not yet. Instead, Adrian opened his laptop, logged into Halcyon's asset dashboard, and smiled at the overdue notice flashing next to Karen's primary residence. 2 payments behind. Karen Whitmore was a storm that wore pearls. 2 days after their awkward introduction, Adrian received his first letter, slid under his door like a warning shot. It was printed on embossed Elmridge Heights Community Association stationery and signed, of course, by Madam President herself. Notice of initial noncompliance, garbage bin visibility, Section 4, Subclause D. Apparently leaving his trash bins tucked beside the garage, but not inside the garage, violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. A warning, no fine. This time, Adrian folded the letter neatly and placed it in a folder marked KW, his version of a war file. The next day, it was the mailbox. Off-shade cobalt, then a note about his front yard's non-conforming mulch type. Assunnasum. A neighbor waved apologetically as he walked by. "She's testing you," the man muttered, then hurried off before Adrian could ask more. This wasn't a HOA. This was a kingdom, and Karen was the self-appointed queen. But unlike her past victims, Adrian wasn't just another naive resident who'd made the mistake of choosing the wrong neighborhood. He was a strategist, a builder, a man who'd spent a decade bootstrapping two fintech startups while battling giants who'd tried to squeeze him out. He didn't just fight, he played long. He didn't own the mortgages himself, not technically. That would have been too obvious. After selling his second company, Adrian had reinvested part of his earnings through Halcyon Capital, a private equity fund notorious for buying distressed residential mortgage packages at steep discounts. Halcyon wasn't a household name, but their tendrils ran deep through suburbia, especially in communities like Elmridge Heights, where inflated lifestyles met tightening credit. Karen Whitmore's homes, yes, plural, were all sitting on a precarious pile of over-leveraged loans. She'd pulled equity from each over the past 5 years. Lavish upgrades, landscape consulting, and, according to property records, a failed short-term rental venture. Adrian had spotted the addresses immediately when reviewing Halcyon's asset list: 203, 217, 219, 240, and 244 Elmridge Crescent. 5 homes, 1 queen, and her empire built on sand. The ironic part? She had no idea she was now technically indebted to the very man she tried to humiliate. It amused Adrian for a while, but the amusement faded quickly as Karen escalated her campaign. She posted passive-aggressive bulletins in the HOA newsletter, clearly aimed at certain newcomers. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city about unlicensed home business activity. Adrian's guests, investors, friends, ex-colleagues, began getting side-eyed when parking on the curb for too long. He even caught Karen photographing his yard. One afternoon, he confronted her casually on the sidewalk. "You seem to spend a lot of time walking past my house, Karen." She gave him a tight smile. "As HOA president, I have a duty to observe community standards. Some residents require extra encouragement." "I'm sure," Adrian said smoothly, "you're quite used to people backing down." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her fingers clutched her clipboard just a little tighter. "The rules are clear. If they're too much, perhaps this isn't the right place for you." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. Maybe it's time the rules were reviewed. That was the first time he saw it, a flicker of uncertainty in her carefully controlled face. Just for a second, then it was gone. That evening, Adrian opened a secure file labeled Mortgage Status, KW. 3 of the 5 properties were still current. 2 were behind, 1 dangerously so. He called Olivia Ng, his old friend from Stanford, now a real estate lawyer with a specialty in HOA law. "I've got a situation," he said. "It's complicated." "Isn't it always?" she replied. "Tell me everything." He did. The power games, the surveillance, the fines, the real estate structure, the mortgage data. Olivia was silent for a long time. "Technically, if Halcyon owns those loans and she defaults," she finally said, "you can initiate foreclosure." "Legally, yes," Adrian said. "Ethically, I'm not looking to destroy her." "Adrian," she said, voice firmer now, "she's harassing you. She's weaponizing a community board to bully residents and protect her own power. You're not just dealing with a petty neighbor. This is targeted, systemic abuse." He was quiet. "You don't have to burn her down," Olivia continued, "but maybe remind her who actually controls the matches." 2 days later, it got worse. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. Her proposal? To preserve the integrity of our neighborhood, all home-based businesses must apply for special permits. Additionally, No more than 2 non-resident visitors per week unless pre-approved by the board. A ridiculous paper-thin attempt to limit Adrian's ability to work, meet, or even have friends over. As she spoke from the community center podium, Adrian looked around. A few residents looked uncomfortable, but no one interrupted. Fear was the mortar Karen had built this neighborhood with. When she finished, she looked directly at Adrian. If anyone feels these rules are too burdensome, perhaps Elmridge is not the right fit. Adrian raised his hand. Has there been a specific issue triggering these new restrictions? He asked, his voice even. Noise complaints? Traffic congestion? Karen's smile thinned. No single incident. We're simply being proactive. We've had some concerns about transient elements entering the community. The word transient hung heavy in the room. Interesting, Adrian said, because as far as I'm aware, the only person who's entered this community in the last month is me. Several heads turned. Karen's smile flickered, but she held her ground. If there's nothing further, one thing, Adrian said, standing now. If these rules pass, I will contest them. Publicly. Legally. And I will personally fund any neighbor's legal fees who wishes to challenge them as well. A small murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The motion passed, but just barely. Back home, Adrian stood by his window, watching the street lamps flicker on. He didn't want to fight, not really, but bullies didn't stop unless pushed. He picked up the phone and called Halcyon Capital's internal asset team. Flag 217 and 240 Elmridge Crescent, he said. Begin pre-foreclosure review. We're not initiating. Just get the paperwork ready. He hung up and exhaled. He wasn't bluffing anymore. Adrian didn't sleep much the night the motion passed. Not because he feared Karen. He was long past that. But because of the implications. If she was bold enough to try rewriting HOA regulations to target him directly, what else had she rewritten in the past? How many lives had she quietly broken with policies crafted in private meetings, rubber-stamped by compliant board members? He wasn't dealing with a petty suburban dictator. He was dealing with a system, one she'd built, controlled, and exploited. And now that system had a crack. By midweek, the pre-foreclosure review reports for 217 and 240 Elmridge Crescent arrived in his encrypted inbox. Karen was not just behind on payments. She was drowning. Property 217, an aging rental she leased to a family of 5, was 90 days delinquent. 240, her pet renovation project, was worse. 3 skipped payments, a lien from an unpaid contractor, and evidence of multiple bounced checks. Her financial empire, propped up by equity extractions and vanity upgrades, was teetering. Adrian cross-referenced these with HOA meeting minutes over the past 2 years. Fines, violations, forced sales. A pattern emerged. Single parents, retirees, recent divorcees. The ones who left under pressure all had one thing in common. Their homes were later purchased by a private buyer at below market price, then flipped or rented at a profit. Adrian circled a name that kept appearing on deeds, W&F Holdings, LLC, a shell company. And its mailing address matched that of Karen's cousin, a man named Gerald Whitmore. He called Olivia again. Got something bigger, he said, possibly criminal. She listened carefully, then responded with the calm of someone used to sharks in suits. She's using her HOA position to identify vulnerable residents, Olivia said, then manufacturing violations, pressuring them to sell, and passing the properties to a buyer she controls. Predatory displacement, Adrian said. Real estate racketeering, she corrected. That's a felony in some states. Adrian leaned back in his chair. The war wasn't about bird feeders or bin placement anymore. This was about money, control, power, and now evidence. Still, Adrian didn't strike. Not yet. He began laying groundwork. He met privately with 3 residents who'd quietly moved out over the past year. One of them, Danielle Perez, had left after being fined over $9,000 for unauthorized landscaping, despite having approved plans in writing. She said my garden was an eyesore, Danielle said bitterly. Then 2 months later, after I moved, her cousin's company bought my house, flipped it, made 60 grand. Another, a retired school teacher, admitted she sold under pressure after racking up mysterious utility complaints. She ruined my retirement, the woman whispered. Adrian documented everything. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling in small, calculated increments. She doubled down on passive-aggressive patrols, sent Adrian 2 more citations, one for unauthorized wind chimes, another for parking proximity violations. He paid them silently, knowing it was bait. Then came the surveillance drone. Adrian caught it hovering over his backyard late one afternoon. He traced the pilot to a teenager on the next street, paid in cash to capture any suspicious activity on a contract assignment. Adrian confiscated the footage, handed the boy a soda, and told him he wasn't in trouble. Then he called a favor. His friend Noah, a cybersecurity expert who once helped him foil a corporate espionage case, agreed to do some digging. Within 48 hours, Noah delivered. Karen's been using HOA funds for unauthorized expenses, he said. Some of them shady as hell. $67,400 in administrative consulting fees, billed to a firm that didn't exist beyond a P.O. box. $31,200 in legal advisory services from a law office that shared its bank account with Whitmore Family Investments. $150,000 plus is collected in fines, with no documentation of allocation. This isn't just abuse, Noah said. It's theft. Adrian was building a storm, but he didn't want thunder. He wanted precision. He began speaking more openly at HOA meetings, asked Karen questions, on record, that she dodged, mentioned transparency, budget reviews, resident rights. She laughed it off at first, but her voice grew tighter each time. The room, once firmly hers, began shifting. People started listening. Whispers followed her out the door. Then came the slip. At the next board session, she snapped at a new resident, a young father named Leo, over a minor fence height violation. You people think you can just come in and change things? You people? The room went quiet. Karen tried to recover, but the damage was done. That night, Adrian drafted the letter. Printed on neutral letterhead, it was written with surgical restraint. No threats, just facts. Dear Ms. Whitmore, as a silent investor in Halcyon Capital, I wanted to inform you that several properties under your name are currently under pre-foreclosure review due to non-payment. Additionally, irregularities have been flagged regarding financial transactions between HOA funds and WNF Holdings. I recommend you consult legal counsel. Transparency protects everyone. Sincerely, a concerned resident. He hand-delivered it. Karen answered in her robe, mid-glass of Chardonnay. What is this? She asked, blinking at the envelope. Information, Adrian said simply. We all need it. He walked away before she could respond. The next morning, a new Karen arrived. No patrols, no letters, no citations. She even smiled falsely when she saw him watering his lawn. But Adrian didn't relax, because retreat was never surrender. It was a regroup. Karen Whitmore did not go quietly. The calm lasted just over a week. Then it began, quiet, subtle, and unmistakably intentional. First, Adrian's mailbox was knocked off its post, twice in 3 days. Then came a series of anonymous code enforcement complaints. Improper tree trimming, excessive noise after 10 p.m., and absurdly, visible laundry. He shrugged them off until his bank called. Mr. Westbrook, said the voice on the other end, tight with concern. Did you authorize a refinance request on your primary residence? No, Adrian replied, cold rising up his spine. I didn't. Someone had submitted documents in his name, forged signature, fake email, real account numbers. The paperwork originated from Prestige Mortgage Services, a boutique lender owned by, surprise, Gerald Whitmore. He froze. This was no longer a neighborhood spat. This was identity fraud. Adrian called Olivia that night. Now she's trying to steal my house. There was a pause, then, you need to go to the police. Now. Detective Raymond Hale reviewed the forged documents, the email logs, and the complaint timeline with stony silence. This is organized, he said finally. Has all the hallmarks of a coordinated campaign. Fraud, harassment, targeted asset manipulation. I'm assuming this won't be handled by your HOA desk guy? Adrian asked. Hale almost smiled. No, this goes upstairs. But Karen wasn't done. When the drone reappeared, this time at night, Adrian had his cameras ready. The footage wasn't blurry anymore. Karen wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, crouching by Adrian's fence line, pouring something at the roots of his Japanese maples. The next morning, the leaves were brown, the bark slick, dead. He filed a police report. This time, Hale didn't hesitate. Criminal trespass, vandalism, will subpoena surveillance from neighbors. But Karen moved faster. The next HOA meeting was called suddenly Emergency Planning. On the agenda, a new clause giving the board broad authority to inspect and find properties without prior notice, and the ability to deny legal representation during hearings. Adrian arrived early, so did Karen. She smiled at him like nothing had happened. "Lovely weather," she said, as if she hadn't just tried to poison his trees and forge a loan in his name. He said nothing. The meeting was pure theater. Karen controlled the podium, the agenda, the microphone. She rattled off new initiatives under the pretense of protecting property values from rogue residents. She never said Adrian's name. She didn't have to. Then she dropped her final card. "We've discovered that certain individuals are engaged in real estate manipulation within our community, flipping properties, threatening long-standing owners with foreclosure. We won't allow that." Adrian stood slowly. "Madam President," he said, voice calm but sharp, "are you suggesting that pointing out financial delinquency, when it directly impacts community solvency, is harassment?" She blinked. "I'm suggesting that bullying through financial intimidation has no place in Elmridge." He took out a folder. "I'd like to introduce this as public record. A review of the past 3 years' HOA financials, showing $187,000 in unexplained consulting fees paid to firms linked to W&F Holdings and your cousin." A silence thicker than concrete filled the room. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Then, "This is slander." "It's documented," Adrian replied, "and I'm not alone in this." 3 residents stood: Danielle, Leo, and Eleanor, the retired school teacher. They spoke each in turn of fabricated violations, threats, manipulated sales, each one ending with the same chilling phrase, "And then Gerald bought my house." Karen's composure cracked, but she didn't yell. She smiled. The kind of smile people wear when they're losing, but already lit the fuse on something bigger. "You think you've exposed something?" she said, voice silky. "You have no idea how deep this goes." She gathered her papers, nodded politely, and left. No one stopped her. That night, Adrian received a text from an unknown number. "You're not just fighting her. Walk away while you can." He increased security, installed motion detectors, camera redundancy, remote cloud sync, because it wasn't just about him anymore. 3 nights later, his car alarm blared at 2:12 a.m. When police arrived, they found brake lines severed, cleanly, professionally. Had he driven it, he would have never seen the curve coming. The footage? 2 hooded men in and out in minutes, one limping slightly. Adrian sent it to Hale. "This is attempted murder now," the detective said grimly, "and she's losing control." Meanwhile, a leak reached him through a whisper chain. Karen had withdrawn $120,000 in cash across multiple accounts. And Gerald had quietly listed 2 Elmridge homes for sale under a new LLC. Adrian felt the timeline accelerating. They were preparing to vanish, but they didn't know what he'd been preparing too. The next HOA meeting wasn't a meeting. It was a trap. Adrian booked the community center, sent invitations to the board, residents, and Detective Hale's team, undercover. He opened the night with a simple statement: "Tonight is about accountability, not revenge, just truth." Then he presented the map, a live chart of money flows between the HOA, Karen, Gerald, and shell companies dating back 5 years. Every fraudulent fine, every foreclosure, every payoff, names, dates, receipts. Then he played the video. Karen, the maples, the chemical jug. You could hear a pin drop. And then came the voice. Adrian connected his phone to the speakers. "I'll pay double whatever Karen offered." It was Gerald, live. He didn't know he was on speaker, didn't know Hale was in the room. He continued, "That idiot cousin of mine was always sloppy. You don't understand what you're sitting on, Westbrook. I can get you into the bigger operation. You walk away from Elmridge, and we both get rich. Karen stood, face pale, hands trembling. You called him? No, Adrian said softly. He called me. Hale stepped forward. Karen Whitmore, Gerald Whitmore, both of you are now persons of interest in an ongoing fraud and conspiracy investigation. Karen said nothing. Gerald on the speaker went silent, then hung up. The trap had worked. Karen was finished. She just didn't know it yet. The trap Adrian laid had worked. Her financial web was exposed. Gerald had implicated himself on a recorded call, and Detective Hale's team had already subpoenaed 5 years of HOA financials. But Adrian wasn't celebrating, because less than 24 hours after the meeting, something happened that chilled him more than brake lines or dead trees ever could. His laptop froze for 2 seconds. Then a message appeared. Incoming file, Howard's insurance policy. Sender, anonymous. Attached, encrypted. .zip inside was a voice file. Adrian played it. Gerald's voice, and another. Male, older, colder. Once the last two flip, she's done. We fold W and F, disappear, and leave Karen holding the bag. Let her take the fall. She's useful, but expendable. The voice wasn't Gerald's. It was Howard Whitmore, Karen's supposedly dead husband. Adrian called Olivia. She said she was widowed. Apparently not, Olivia replied grimly. I just pulled court records. Howard Whitmore was indicted for embezzlement in 2017. Disappeared before trial. Presumed dead, but never confirmed. He's not dead, Adrian said. He's managing everything behind the curtain. And Gerald was the muscle, Olivia finished. Karen? She was the mask. The realization shifted everything. Karen wasn't just a villain. She was also a pawn. A dangerous, complicit pawn, but not the mastermind. Howard had built this. And then another thread pulled loose. The anonymous file had metadata tags, with one familiar email address. Adrian stared at it. Henry.Davidson, meridianfundgroup.com. Henry, his former CFO. The man who'd helped Adrian vet the Halcyon investment in the first place. The one who'd suggested Elmridge Heights as a quiet, stable neighborhood. He hadn't just been watching. He'd steered Adrian straight into the lion's den. Adrian didn't say a word. He simply packed a bag, drove to Henry's office, and walked in unannounced. The receptionist froze. Is he in? He left. Vacation. Indefinitely. Of course. Back home, Adrian opened a secure channel and called Hale. I have a bigger name, he said. Howard Whitmore is alive, and I think he's about to disappear. For good. Send everything you have, Hale said. We'll notify federal agents. And one more, Adrian added. Henry Davidson, my ex-CFO, he's in on it. That night, Adrian's security system alerted him at 1:41 a.m. Another manila envelope on the doorstep. Inside, a photo of Adrian shaking hands with Henry, taken years ago, standing beside a blurry third figure. Karen. On the back, a handwritten message. You never understood the game. Walk away. You're not ready for what's next. Adrian didn't walk away. He leaned in. He called every homeowner Karen had ever fined. Every resident pushed out. Every one of them ready to talk now. The file grew. Testimonies, transfer documents, HOA minutes, wire transfers. Then came the twist. One resident, an IT tech named Roland, had archived security footage from a drone incident last year. The pilot, Gerald's teenage son, using equipment borrowed from Meridian Fund's office tech pool. The ties were undeniable. Within days, Hale's office initiated joint investigations across state lines. The IRS got involved. The FBI opened a fraud case. And then came the blow that shattered everything. Howard Whitmore was arrested in Italy, trying to board a yacht registered to a shell company with connections to real estate holdings in 3 states. He was carrying a briefcase of crypto wallets and a one-way plane ticket to the Maldives. Karen Corner did what no one expected. She cooperated. She testified against Howard, against Gerald, against Henry. She handed over internal HOA communications, secret payments, and the full client list of every targeted homeowner. She even apologized, publicly. Not everyone forgave her, but the law was satisfied. She received 5 years probation, 200 hours community service, and was ordered to repay $412,000 in restitution. She sold 4 of her 5 properties. The 5th, she begged to keep. Adrian let her. The HOA was gutted and rebuilt. Elections were held. And in a twist of fate, Adrian, quiet, low profile, t-shirt and boots Adrian, was elected president. He rewrote the bylaws, made every fine appealable, installed financial oversight panels, dismantled the toxic power structure Karen had built. The final email came weeks later, from Henry. One line, "You still think you won?" Adrian didn't respond, because this wasn't about winning. It was about freeing a community from fear. Elmridge Heights felt different. Gone were the silent nods, the tension under smiles, the fear of stepping one toe outside invisible lines. The hedges still trimmed, the lawn still green, but something more important had taken root. Freedom. The HOA now had transparency portals. Residents could see budgets in real time. Fines required evidence. Every meeting was recorded, every vote documented. But the biggest change? Neighbors spoke to each other. For real. Adrian stood quietly at the community BBQ, the event once ruled with an iron grill by Karen. This time it was hosted by a rotating team of volunteers. A middle-aged couple ran the drinks table. Teenagers DJ'd from a phone. Kids darted between adults, dripping with popsicle juice and laughter. No citations, no clipboards, just people. Karen didn't come. She didn't need to. She was there every morning now, at the cafe on Main Street, working the counter with quiet hands and lowered eyes. Adrian saw her once. She glanced up, froze, then looked down. He didn't say anything, but as he turned to leave, she called out softly, "Why didn't you take everything?" Adrian paused, then replied without turning around, "Because I didn't come here to win. I came to live." Karen's condo, her only remaining asset, was in a building owned by a housing fund Adrian helped create after the dust settled. He had the power to push her out. He never used it. Instead, he instructed the property manager, "Treat her like anyone else. No more, no less." Howard Whitmore received 12 years in federal prison. Gerald took a plea deal, 5 years. He turned on Howard in the end. Henry Davidson disappeared into legal proceedings and settlements. His name now a cautionary tale in boardrooms. The fraud network they helped build was dismantled across 3 states. Millions in recovered assets. Dozens of manipulated sales reversed. Families compensated. Adrian even helped 6 families return to Elmridge, the same families Karen once pushed out. When the Vasquezes moved back into 217 Elmridge, neighbors formed a welcoming committee. Danielle cried in the driveway. Adrian didn't stop there. He founded the Homeground Initiative, a startup-turned-social movement focused on protecting vulnerable homeowners from HOA abuse and real estate fraud. He partnered with lawyers, former regulators, technologists, built open-source legal tools, funded micro-grants for legal defense. He made it easy for the next Adrian to fight back smart, without needing to be rich or ruthless. He still lived in the same house, still drove the same car, but now he walked the neighborhood not as a stranger or a suspect, but as someone people nodded to, genuinely. He even started dating again, slowly. A woman from the next town, a teacher. They had coffee every Friday on the cafe patio. Karen never interrupted. She just served the drinks, eyes always on the cup. Adrian never brought up the past. He didn't need to. One evening, after hosting a story night for the kids of Elmridge, he stood on his porch and watched the lights blink on across the street. No more drones, no more fines, no more fear, just families. He picked up a bottle of root beer from the cooler beside him, took a sip and smiled. A simple one, the kind that says, "We made it." Karen applied to join the new HOA support board the following year. Not as president, as a volunteer, she was accepted, quietly, cautiously, but accepted. Adrian voted yes, because redemption isn't just possible, it's essential. Sometimes power isn't about control. It's about giving others the space to be free. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one hiding the most. Karen built a kingdom on fear, silence, and fake rules. But all it took was one quiet resident with the right leverage to bring it all down. And if you think this story was wild, just wait till you hear what the next HOA Karen tried to do. Subscribe, hit that bell, and welcome to the HOA Karen Files. Real stories, real power plays, real karma,